I was thinking this morning very carefully about what I would say this evening and to introduce my dear friend. And I reflected on the fact that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, biased though I may be, but I still don't think it's an exaggeration, to say that Andrew Goldstein is arguably the most significant rabbi that Leo Baeck College has yet produced. And I say that because Andrew has done everything. He's founded a congregation and built it up to very significant size. He created groundbreaking education projects for the ULPS and an excellent education department. And I remember things like ULPS Sports Day and Project Day and Orbit Club, all of which was inspired by Andrew. Andrew is also the rabbi who didn't stay put. He opened up Eastern Europe before Eastern Europe was opened up and has played a really important role in what used to be called Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. And he's gone on working in Europe and in the UK, even long into his retirement. Andrew's also a liturgist and an anthologist, as I know particularly. He's done a PhD. He's done a trip in the footsteps with Sharon of Sir Moses Montefiore, and he's been a very successful travel agent over the years, taking groups of people to very exciting and different places and giving them an experience they would never have had from anybody else. And of course, he is now, as is wholly appropriate, the president of Liberal Judaism. Andrew gets his teeth into all sorts of things, and his enthusiasm is infectious, and I'm sure that will be sent over the airwaves to all of you tonight as he talks about Amy Blank. Andrew.
Thank you, Charles. I think there are many more, I can think of many more graduates of the Leo Baeck College than myself who are a great way above me, but there you go. Thank you for that wonderful, I don't know, I wasn't listening. I sort of switched off after a moment because it seemed too much. And what you didn't say, I don't think, is that you and I have been great friends for a long, long time and continue that way. Anyway, it's nice to see you all, or at least the ones who've put their screen on, the camera on, to see you all in this country and abroad. And thank you for joining me. Some of you have already read the theme of tonight's talk. It appeared in the Liberal Jewish News a week or so ago. And some of you even might go back to a sermon I gave, which started off my search, a sermon I gave at the Ark Synagogue. My journey started with the Sedra Chayei Sarah, and the women of Reformed Judaism, a most incredible and perhaps the latest of the Chumashim produced by the Reform movement in America. And a poem in it led me to one of the early liberal Jews who was the founder of the first Liberal Jewish Youth Club and took me through great poetry to John Rayner, Jane Rayner, to Israel Mattock, Albert Friedlander, and the Leo Baeck College, and to Hebrew Union College. You never know what you'll find when you're looking for a sermon based on the week's Torah portion. And so Amy K. Blank, whose name I vaguely knew, but about whom I knew nothing. And so I ask you to join me as I recreate my search. My journey started with a woman's journey. Amy K. Blank, there's her dates. We'll come on to those in a moment. But in the Torah portion, Chayei Sarah, which is Genesis chapter 24, in that Sedra, we find Rebecca leaving home in Haran with Abraham's servant to travel to Canaan to marry Isaac. a man she'd never met. Searching away into the text, I looked at this women's commentary, and there I found a wonderful poem by Amy K. Blank. And so, Leah, let's have the poem. It's headed Rebecca. And think of Rebecca now as I read the poem and on that journey. I left home easily, as when a seed drops from the tree, carefree, for I knew not what. I stuffed my toys into the saddlebag, braided my hair, and for the dusty journey wore my broidered gown. I chose my camel and set out, light-hearted, to enjoy adventure, scarcely a pang as tents and trees of home faded into the wilderness. But this I wondered, how would it befit to ask that awesome man, Abraham's servant, what manner was he to whom I was betrothed? Better hold the question, I decided. Isaac, after all, was a kinsman, one more fabulous Abraham's son, and I would be his daughter. Daughter, sister, wife, hardly a difference in my young mind. I realized as I read that poem and found it that Amy Blank really did bring out the human situation, and with a trace of humor and insight. Amy Blank, it may be about 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago, look her up, though I'd heard her name before. Amy Blank turned out to be an unsung hero, early hero or member of liberal Judaism. We all know about Lily Montagu, but what about Amy Blank? There's no mention of her in the official history of our first 100 years by Rosita Rosenberg and Rabbi Lawrence Riegel. I searched Wikipedia and her name didn't immediately pop up. But eventually I did find a notice of her death in a site entitled Jewish Women's Archive, and it's worth looking it up. The notice was headed, "The Death of Writer Amy K. Blank, September the 17th, 1990. And I found out that she was born in 1898, that her father, Karl Kirschberger, was a wealthy import-export businessman whose company was based in London, and also in Frankfurt, and also the Far East. The Kirschbergers had a large house in Gerrard's Cross, and the Mattocks had a house in nearby Beaconsfield. And maybe we got a picture of that house. It's coming up. Israel Mattock, for those who don't know, if for people from abroad, one of the founders of our movement, working and studying Wildwood in North End, Hampstead, but there's also the house there in Beaconsfield in 1916. And we'll see that's a house that Amy must have visited and on many occasions. And actually, I think, Leah, we've got another picture of yet another house of the Mattocks, which Amy would have known well. Anyway, the Mattocks and the Kirschbergers, and for those not sure of the geography, Gerrard's Cross and Beaconsfield are about 15 miles from the centre of London, countryside. And the Mattocks and the Kirschbergers became good friends. And Mattock once described Amy as almost like a daughter. Amy was brought up in, well, she was taught by a governess. She was taught European languages, piano, singing, and often traveled with the family around Europe. She attended some classes at University College London. And like so many of her milieu, she got involved in social work in the East End of London. Her parents were the early members of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, and she was the secretary of the Alumni Society for young people that was started by Rabbi Mattock in 1918, and so I claimed there at the beginning of our youth movement. And the following year, she opened a branch of the religion school in Gerrard's Cross. I presume it was in her family home. And she began studying with Mattock and Claude Montefiore, the other one of our founders. And it seems she became a sort of a secretary to Mattock and involved with him in the development of liberal Judaism. She searched out poetry that he used in his liberal Jewish prayer books, and he included one of hers in volume 1. For those who want to look it up, it's page 440. And she read this poem at his funeral. The poem starts as follows, and let's see the text. This is the poem that we have in our volume 1. I will lift up my hands unto thee, O my God. So shall I praise thee, for as the flower breaketh forth from the bud, and from the blind earth riseth forth the stem and pusheth from the root, the eager shoot upwards and upwards, so shall I praise thee, Lord of light, with lifted hands. Okay, it's an early poem, reflecting perhaps the culture of her Edwardian upbringing. In 1925, a young rabbi from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where of course Mattock had studied, this rabbi visited London and the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. Sheldon Blank was his name, and we have a picture of him in, not as a young man, but later on. He and Amy fell in love and were married a year later in 1926. He came over to England on his way to start research as an archaeologist in Palestine, as it then was. And he came back and they got married. And so this very English young woman crossed the pond to a new environment. And I do wonder if the Rebecca poem was a reflection of her own thoughts as she left her parents and the circle in which she was well established for a new life to join her husband in Cincinnati. Rabbi Sheldon Blank became the Nelson Gluck Professor of Bible at Hebrew Union College and the editor of the Hebrew Union College Annual for, I believe, 6 decades, and the author of several books, mostly on biblical subjects like Jeremiah, Man and Prophet. And actually, Amy wrote many biblical-based poems, and as I said, many of them appear in the woman's commentary to the Torah. Sheldon was very much a leader of American Reform Judaism. But seemingly, definitely Amy adapted easily, though never losing her English accent. And she became a much loved and integral part of college life. The online obituary says, and I quote, she created theatrical productions performed by Hebrew Union College students in her home in Cincinnati. There were sumptuous meetings in her home with visitors to the college, accompanied by, there were frequent meetings accompanied by Amy's sumptuous meals. As her daughter Miriam Sachs recalls, it wasn't uncommon to have 20 people sleeping in the house at once, on couches, mattresses, on the floor, etc., including an old double bed in the attic, known as the bed of affliction. My dear friend, Rabbi Howard Berman, as a convinced Anglophile, spent a year at the Leo Baeck College in the early 1970s. And he sent me a wonderful description of Amy, the professor's wife. Howard said, I adored Amy Blank. She totally embodied the spirit, culture, and principles of British liberal Judaism. Her warm, graceful, Lily Montague-like spirituality provided a counterpoint to Sheldon's remote, intellectual, and rationalist version of American reform. He was always the professor. She was a pastoral presence to generations of HUC students. We respected him, but loved her. He carries on. They had a weekly Sabbath afternoon tea for selected students, including those who read and preached at the college chapel each week. As the chapel coordinator, that's Howard, was present most Saturday afternoons, sitting in their gracious living room in their elegant home near the college campus, with a fire burning and always a lovely high tea is a vivid memory. We would discuss the morning's parashah and sermon, and Amy would share her poetry or lyrical reflections on the dominant themes. Of course, she always deeply appreciated my love of classical reform, and my London experience created a special bond between us. I read that Amy wrote stories for children about biblical prophets, and a children's Passover Haggadah still used by her grandchildren. I would love to see that Haggadah and the family chronicles that she wrote every day to her families. And I'm sure they're there in the archives at the American Jewish Archives at Hebrew Union College. And this led me to another rabbinic family whose name I knew but had never met. Pam Fox, our member who has written one of the biographies of Dr. Mattock, told me that there is a large collection of Mattock's papers in the American Jewish Archives on the campus, as I said, of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Well, I can see him on the screen now. HUC professor Michael Mayer, who I'd been in touch with arranging his recent talk to European rabbis on Leo Beck, put me in touch with Dana Herman, the research director of the archives. And indeed, I found that there are many files of correspondence between Mattock and Amy Blank and from Amy's family. Next day, I heard from Aliza Spicehandler, the associate archivist who's also on the screen with us tonight, who had scanned some papers and sent them through to me. Indeed, it was fascinating stuff that I think sheds great light into the personality, not just of Amy, but of Dr. Mattock. A letter, for instance, from Mattock to Amy, written on the 15th of June, 1942, expressing his concerns about the survival of Jewry on the European continent. And an early one, the 28th of July, 1938, which thankfully is typed, because I can tell you his handwriting is not easy to read. He opens the letter, "Dear Amy, I must dictate rather than write because of my rheumatically arm." He goes on to comment on a number of German refugee rabbis he's seeking to obtain for liberal Jewish congregations that he's forming in North London, in Brighton, and also working on one in South London and others. This is just before the war, when liberal Judaism is really beginning to expand. Anyway, he discusses a number of rabbis about whom Amy had given him details, and he's very frank about one. Starles, I am told, did all he could to damage the English ministry in the sight of American possibilities. I'm not surprised. Of another rabbi, he says, "I can say in confidence, he's a very conceited fellow and does not take kindly to suggestions." He doesn't name that one. And so there's other things in the letter when it just shows how frank he is and how precious she is to him. Towards the end of his life, Mattock confided in Amy about the politics of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. He said, "My ruling was accepted by Reinhardt," and most of you will know Reinhardt was a sort of a reform rabbi in London. "My ruling was accepted, but Reinhardt opposed it. I said I would take it as a motion of no confidence and get out. But Miss M," that's Lily Montagu, "dissuaded me." In another letter, he says, "Dr. E, who is much taken by selfish ambition and adopted blackmail to achieve his end," and so on. At least this one is, that comment is headed, What follows is only for you. Just a few snippets to illustrate that the relationship with Rabbi Dr. Israel Mattock and Amy Kirschberger Blank was close indeed. He usually signed his letters to her, Love, I. Israel Isidore Mattock, obviously. I came to believe that Amy was a valuable sounding board for Mattock at the time when he really was building up our movement. And so I see her as an unsung hero in our story. But it's not just Mattock using Amy as a confidant. They also appraised each other's work. In June 1953, he wrote, "I'm glad you liked my ethics and thank you for pushing it," presumably among the American and HUC rabbis. His book entitled Jewish Ethics was published that year. But she sent him her poems, seemingly one by one, and he commented on them. For instance, "I think the poem good. I appreciate the similes. They are kind and affectionate. I appreciate also your mysticism, though occasionally difficult." On a poem about Isaac, he asks, "Why does she use the word shofar rather than trumpet?" Though on reflection, he says, shofar sounds softer and more poetic. So he's going into the poems and analyzing them and giving her comments on the poem. He asked if he can help her get her poems published. "Do you want me to try the Poetry Review?" he said. "Or how about the Jewish Publication Society of America or Sonsino Press over here?" In fact, her book, The Chosen Spoken Choice, in fact, she wrote 6 books of poetry, but her book, The Spoken Choice, about what he's talking, was printed by the Hebrew Union College Press. When Elisa Spicehandler sent me copies of such letters, I wrote thanking her and asking, was she related to the famous Rabbi Ezra Spicehandler? And she wrote back to say she was his granddaughter, and both her mother and aunt were Reform rabbis. And she added another illustration of Amy Blank. She wrote, "I actually spoke with my mum about Amy Blank after last week's initial research dive, and she told me that they used to go to the Blanks for Sukkot. My mum was obviously very young when she knew Amy, but she said that Amy had a really cultured, bohemian, artistic, intellectual, salon-type energy, which my mum enjoyed immensely and was somewhat inspired by. Amy's accomplishments in writing and artistic expressions, her intellectual recognition from her spouse and partner, as well as her remarkable individual achievements, etc. She was definitely not the average housewife one encountered in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the connections continued. I mentioned to Jane Rayner, Rabbi John Rayner, Alav Shalom's wife, I mentioned to her this contact. And she said that the Spicehandler spent Shabbat and Seder with them whilst Professor Ezra Spicehandler was a fellow at the Oxford Center for Post-Biblical Hebrew. The progressive Jewish world is indeed connected. And Amy Blank and Dr. Mattock exemplify the close links and influences that British liberal Judaism has with American Reform Judaism. After all, Dr. Mattock was ordained in Hebrew Union College, and we have benefited from a number of American rabbis from then on. May I mention Rabbi Sidney Bristow, Chaim Stern, Frank Hellner, and others. Dr. Mattock based his prayer books on the existing American books, and we gave American Reform 2 new prayer books, Service of the Heart and Gate of Repentance. To conclude with more poetry, Jane Rayner gave me a book entitled Forever, Never. The title page says 100 copies privately printed in Cincinnati, 1963. It's a small book of haiku, the form much in vogue in the 1960s. One example is entitled, and you can put it on the screen, November 1918. Hush of fallen leaves, nation hold the breath of hate, 2 minutes silence. Says a lot, doesn't it? And more connections, for the book is inscribed, for Marjorie, with love, Amy. Marjorie Moose, another unsung hero of early liberal Judaism, the great and first educator. And thank you, Jane, for this precious gift. And for those new to liberal Judaism and not sure of all the names I am dropping, do obtain a copy of Rosita Rosenberg and Lawrence Riegel's The First 100 Years of Liberal Judaism. And now, with 20 years later, I wonder who's going to write the 120 years, or at least the last 2 decades of our movement. I managed to buy another book entitled, as I said, The Spoken Choice, published in 1959, though I know there was a reprint in 2012, such is its popularity. And by the way, I saw many other copies online. And this book had the name of its first owner written inside. And I opened it up, and there it was. Who owned this book? Albert Friedlander. And so the Amy connections multiply. But let me end with a couple of poems from this book. The first is entitled, And So at Last I Am. It's a tribute to Israel Matak. And maybe it's an update of her earlier poem. And I wonder if she read this version at the funeral or the original one. Anyway, Dr. Matak, the inspiration of her life and a key founder of liberal Judaism, whose anniversary we celebrate this year. And so at last, to I am. Once when the grass was green, I saw your hands uplifted and your eyes filled with the glory seen in heaven. The skies fell drop by drop into your hollow hands, upheld in prayer, once when the flowers were fair. No need to turn the glass, the sand is only halfway spent. Still your tense fingers probe into the dark and you demand to feel the fringes of the robe and find it not at all. Now are your palms open towards the earth. Open the spirit, now to spirit's dearth. And so at last your hands may fall, quietly turned inwards at your sides. No troubled need to fret and call, the God recalcitrant, for there abides all of your life, the yea, the inward well of silence with you now. There needs no flame of spirit on your brow. And let me end with another biblical poem. And as I said, there are several in that woman's anthology, and also several in this book that I purchased, and I now got to try and buy some of the others, and I'd love to find her Haggadah. Anyway, this poem is another comment on Rebecca. Becca is now pregnant with Isaac's children, and she pictures, I think, beautifully, Isaac, the weak patriarch. They say damaged by his encounter with the Akedah and the near sacrifice by his father. And I think this is brought out both the character of Isaac and also of the 2 sons. It's actually entitled From I Know 4, but in the book, but I'm only giving you 2 of the verses. Now, this is Rebecca. Now that I'm big with child, so big, I think with twins, I chuckle. Will our silence be maintained? Womanhood is set on me, I have grown strong, and I will hold 2 tumbling sons in check whilst Isaac dreams. Yes, and sometimes shrieks in dream. What was done to him, he does not say. When he wakes, he goes into the fields, listens to the bubbling well, the ewe calling from the hill, the wind, and he is comforted. I will be mother and father too to those hot-headed sons. I feel them kicking, struggling in the womb. They will be silent before Isaac. Actually, I think we've got something missing. Let me carry on. Before we get to this one, there's something missing. So listen to me. No, sorry, I've got it. Sorry, I am the difficulty of reading off the screen and reading my paper for a aging rabbi is not easy. Anyway, let's go back. Sorry, Leah, let's go back to 4. Jacob and Esau grown. Jacob is Isaac's son in tenderness. For this I love him. And Esau in lustiness is mine. Isaac loves him for this. Isaac, blind and patient, is fulfilled in blessing. I stole the blessing. I sent Jacob to Haran. I saved Esau from Cain's sin. Though I yearn for Jacob and tremble for his return, I'm strong enough to draw this house together. The tent cords must not slacken. I will hold taut. I think a wonderful poem on Rebecca. And I think in a way, it leads me back to Amy K. Blank. And I've learned a lot about her on this journey. And I look forward to finding out more. And as I say, although she only spent, well, the first part of her life in London, I think she had a great impact on the early stages of our movement, to the impact she had on Israel Matak. So thank you, Amy Kirschberger Blank. It's been great getting to know you. And I hope by bringing it to a larger audience, I will interest other people in your story and in your poetry. Anyway, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. And I can see Charles is applauding and everyone is joining in with the tributes. This is now your opportunity you can unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand virtually, or just wave at me if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. And I can see, oh no, Patricia had her hand up, but now hand's gone down again. Professor Michael Meyer has his hand up.
I think I can add a couple of memories from
please.
that I knew her in Cincinnati. One is that each year at Sukkot, Amy and Sheldon would invite the entire faculty and student body to come to their sukkah, which was on the porch in their very lovely house, not far from the Hebrew Union College. And what everyone remembers is that each year you were asked one question: white wine or red wine? And you had to make your choice. The other memory is a very poignant one. When Sheldon Blank, who reached a very high age, was very sick and not far from death, Amy Blank insisted that he not die in a hospital. She had a hospital bed brought to her living room, and day and night she sat there and recounted to her husband early memories from the first years of their marriage. I found that very poignant, and very characteristic of the very close relationship that those two had. If you would see them on the street, it would look a little strange because Amy was quite tall and Sheldon Blank was quite short. But that didn't make any difference
Right.
at all in their relationship. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That's very valuable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I don't know if anyone else has a question or another memory, maybe. I don't know if there are others here who knew her or anyone, any questions for.
I see Rabbi Nancy Morris there.
Yeah, I can, but I can see that Bob Kirk, I think, had his hand up. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Amy was a member of the LJS Religion School, and we have in our archives a book put together by the pupils during World War I. It contains a number of poetic contributions by Amy. Very interesting.
Thank you. I'd love to see that. Obviously, that was the religion school that she founded in the home out in the.
No, I think this must have been at St. John's Wood.
Okay, all right. So obviously, there's more work to do. Thank you for those.
Absolutely.
Can anyone else help us out with some more pictures on this story?
Or questions, of course.
Aliza, yes. Oh, thank you.
So I will just read out what Aliza has posted in the chat. I'm curious if in the course of your research, did you find out more about Amy's relationship with her sister, Sissy, who was an Anglican nun?
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting.
Aliza, you did tell me that, but I didn't find out any more. I'm just starting on this journey. But I felt that I wouldn't mention it, but why not? It just sort of adds another fascinating chapter to the story. And somebody who's a real historian should really get to grips with this. It's got a lot to say.
Thank you. Anyone, any other questions or comments? If it's Anne is, there we go.
She was also a very great friend of Marjorie Moose,
right,
who often talked about her. And in fact, I think gave talks about her.
Yeah, so clearly this was the book that Jane Rayner gave me. And so it's rather wonderful. Yeah.
Very wonderful indeed. Tony.
Maybe it's just an observation, but I wondered if Andrew would comment on it. What a funny coincidence that we're talking about places only a stone's throw from Northwood, really. If you're talking about Beaconsfield and Gerard, was it Gerrard's Cross? Did you say?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's along the road, really. There wouldn't have been many Jewish people in that area back in the day, but it's lovely to think how close that is.
It was for those people who are not members of or living in London or members of our synagogue, of course. Yes, they're both about 5 miles, a bit further out from the centre of London, from the Northwood. I mean, I think the answer was that many people had houses that, well, not many people, sort of a growing upper middle class had houses there because there was a fast railway train into Marylebone, which was round the corner from the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. And therefore, it was a very convenient place to have a country home. But as I said, Mattock also at the same time had a house in London.
Maybe while we're waiting, if there are any other questions, I'll pose to you the question which we've had in the last few sessions for everyone to contemplate. What would Amy, looking at our movement, what would Amy say we've really succeeded in? What do we still have to do work on to ensure that we'll grow from strength to strength for the next 120 years?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? From the stories that I had from Aliza, and from Rabbi Howard Berman, and now from Michael. I mean, one of them was actually hospitality. And I think that for me, that's also something that what were the memories people had? They had memories of her hospitality and her warmth and her personal support. Now that's a challenge that I hope I see Omar, our care coordinator, on there. I hope he takes that into he'll take that to some of our members. But I think that that's important. I'd like to think that we're also a literary movement, and I know that I can tell the others who do not know that Rabbi Leah Goldstein is sort of Charles and my successor as a liturgist, and she produces wonderful services, at least for the Ark Synagogue, every week, filled with poetry from other contemporary poets. And I think our love of poetry certainly comes there. We're going to have something from Pam Fox in a minute, but I think that would be my answer, that we're still interested in creative liturgy. That was something that Matek was involved in and that she was involved in. And I think when we then look at the Service of the Heart and Siddur Lev Chadash and now our new ventures, I think that that's something we'd have. I think that something that, Matek very much was involved in, that was the insistence on social justice in a very practical way amongst the poor. And a certain Rabbi Leah Goldstein gave a stunning sermon a couple of weeks ago about the poor in our society at the moment. A situation that's getting worse, and hopefully that is something that we're interested in. Okay, well, that'll do for a start, because I see Pam Fox is there. Pam, who wrote the biography of...
Absolutely. I don't know, Pam, if you want to unmute yourself, or if you want to leave it with the comment in the chat. I can see you're unmuting yourself. Yeah.
Thank you for including me. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what you said about the papers in the American Jewish archives. They were really, really rich material. I spent a month looking at various papers, including those. I have to say that both Amy and Rabbi Matek's handwriting is illegible. Yeah. So you have to be really committed to wade your way through the paperwork, but I think the effort would be worth it. There's a lot of poetry included in those letters, yep, and a lot of interesting material about Matek's final years and his feelings about the direction of LJ, his feeling of kind of being distanced from it and losing control, really. Yeah. They're quite historic, those letters.
Yeah, well, maybe one day I'll find the time to go, and because I've been invited by Aliza, as she puts in the chat that there's some more stuff coming along, and I have to say she sent me instantly and almost by us. It's such an amazing thing, American Jewish Archives, and it came overnight, a whole bunch of stuff. And yes, the handwriting is difficult, but also there's so much more there, and I need another lifetime to follow it up. In fact, there's somewhere in this book of poetry you mentioned Matek's sort of final, if I can find it, a poem here about old age, and it's very, and I suspect it's one that she had coming from it, and actually, Charles, there's a couple of poems here we missed out on. We discovered her earlier. We certainly would put in our anthology, because she's got some wonderful ones in here.
Andrew, I wonder whether it's worth mentioning what I put in the chat, that in various documents and letters that I saw, that Matek referred to Amy frequently as being like a daughter.
Yeah, I said that early in the talk, that's what that I'd found, that she was. That's really, and it's a very special relationship, isn't it? And all of those letters, often on those blue, thin blue,
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
ML letters used to buy, you know, stick them over, and then when you eventually got them, you'd rip them because in opening them they wouldn't come out, and they're written on that. This was before email, wasn't it? You know, the constant backwards and forwards, and of course, I don't think you can tell me in the archives are the Amy's. I mean, these are the letters that he sent to her. Do we have at the LGS her letters to Mattock?
Both are in the same file at the AJA. They're together.
Oh, they are, yes. All right, okay. That's still to come then, still to come. And clearly just a few of them. But
Wonderful. I can see we probably need to sponsor a trip for you, Andrew, so that you can go and visit Cincinnati.
Well, there you go. There you go. Who knows? Maybe.
Who knows? Oh, and they have fellowships available. There you go, Andrew. You can get a fellowship to come to Cincinnati.
Put me down.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Charlotte Alton Eldridge has a comment or a question.
No comment, and it's to Rabbi Andrew and to everyone who's been taking part in this course. Rabbi Andrew, I don't know if you can remember me at the Bet Din. You interviewed me.
Is that right?
With Rabbi Mark.
Yes.
And Rabbi Janet Burden.
Okay.
And Rabbi Rebecca came with me.
Yes.
And Rabbi Frank Helner. And I believe Rabbi Danny Rich had written in my favor of joining you. And that was in 2017.
Right.
And I just want to say how you have brought the movement alive with your enthusiasm. I'm afraid I was late joining you. I couldn't bring you on Zoom, but I did manage in the end.
Oh, good. I'm delighted.
It was so enthusiastic, and that's what I feel so much about liberal Judaism.
Thank you very much. And I do remember that day, but you were certainly, you were welcome to Judaism by quite a cohort of rabbis, so that must be something special. I found at least one poem, actually.
While you're just getting to the poem, I just wanted to make sure that Charlotte knows that we are putting the talk on YouTube afterwards. So if you missed the beginning, you can always catch up with it as well. Sorry, Andrew.
I mean, just one I just opened in this book. It's actually entitled Isaiah 6, a reflection on old age. So there we go. And it starts like this, and I'll have to contemplate it as I get older. Anyway, it's the years tread hard, pacing the measure of a life backwards, as in a dream. The scythe-edged eyes of youth once cut between the shard of matter and God's infinitude, and saw the smooth cleft gleam. Words set the jeweled truth, strong words to speak the incorporeal. No glance nor syllable was false. Vision to lips, communication was all true. The inconceivable set forth in truth and holiness. This only youth could do. And so on, it goes on like that. And so a number of them. She's great. Thank you, Amy.
Wonderful, wonderful. It seems like with old age, one should close.
Yes, indeed.
but I don't want to prevent anyone from the opportunity to just comment if anyone feels like they haven't yet commented. Many people saying in the chat also how beautiful the poetry really is. And I hope, Andrew, that this was just an introduction for our movement to the beautiful poetry of Amy K. Blank, and that we will see more of her in our services or in our colleagues' sermons. We should probably make sure that all of our rabbinic colleagues also see it, and maybe it could be an element of the Ballet Tefillah course as well, that we introduce all of the students on that program to some of the creative poetry. Really beautiful. Thank you so much, Andrew, for a wonderful evening. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And we meet once more next week before we take a short break. Next week is going to be a beautiful conversation between Rabbi Aaron Goldstein and Ruth Shire. And it's going to be a conversation where they're going to explore some of Ruth's memories to give all of you an opportunity to weave your own stories also into the story of the history of 120 years of liberal Judaism. So make sure you're here, make sure you're around to be able to share stories, maybe to reminisce a little bit with Ruth about the moments that you shared with her, or to do a bit of a Talmudic tale where a moment in Ruth's life reminded you of another story of liberal Judaism. But that will be a beautiful ending, I'm sure, to our series, to our block, which looked a little bit more at the history of liberal Judaism, as we get ready for our next block, starting in March, where we'll look at liberal Jewish practice. And by next week, we'll have ready for you already an overview of what's coming up in the next set that we're looking forward to welcoming you all back. So for now, I hope you'll have a wonderful evening. It's lovely to see you all. Good night, and thank you again to Andrew, and of course thank you to Charles also for the lovely introduction.
And thank you, Leah, for putting the slides together. And I also noticed as I'm flicking through the people there, Alison Turner, who is the archivist for Liberal Judaism, and she was also helpful in my search. Thank you.